Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us on today's panel discussion webinar, a best practice blueprint for eGRC, brought to you by the eGRC Forum. The eGRC Forum produces educational events for the governance, risk management, and compliance community, and we provide free market intelligence to all of our members. If you're not already a member, you can register at www.itgrcforum.com. I'm Kelly Vick, the host of today's program, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. We welcome back Brandon Dunlap as moderator. Brandon is the Managing Director of Research at Brightfly. He has more than 15 years of experience managing business technology risk in large and small organizations, and he focuses on bridging the gaps within information technology, security, risk, compliance, and audit disciplines. And on the panel, we have Renee Murphy, Senior Analyst serving security and risk professionals at Forrester Research, Mike Roast, Vice President of Marketing for the Americas at MetricStream, and Vivek Shivananda, Co-Founder and CEO of RSAM. We'll run through a more detailed introduction with our panel in a moment, but first I'll go over the housekeeping and the agenda. The webcast is streaming live, and all lines will be in listen-only mode for the duration of the conference. If you have any issue with the audio, please first check your device settings before contacting technical support. For maximum quality, you can click to view in full screen on the bottom right-hand side of your console. Next, we want to hear from you, and we do hope to get your feedback during today's session. If you have any suggestions for future topics, please let us know. We value feedback, and we take it into consideration when planning future events. Please submit this through the Ratings tab on your console. We'll also be taking your questions throughout today's discussion. You can submit these at any time using the question button, and if we don't manage to answer all of your questions today, we'll respond by email. If you'd like a copy of today's slides, you can download these through the Attachments tab, where you can also view some related white papers and use cases, so please take a look there. And finally, after the live presentation, this webcast will be available on demand, so please share with any colleagues who you think may be interested in the topic. Moving on to the agenda. We'll begin with the panel introduction before the audience Q&A roundtable discussion facilitated by Brandon. After the discussion, we'll close out with some key takeaways and further information from our speakers. So now, without further ado, I'll turn the program over for today's discussion. Over to you, Brandon.
Thanks so much, Kelly, and to the eGRC Forum. It's great to be back on here. Always a pleasure to have such esteemed folks in the panel. And I do want to remind you there in the audience listening live to us, don't be shy. Get those questions out there. We want to make sure that we get those answered for you. So let's start off. Renee, I'd like you to tell us a little bit about yourself, the point of view you'll be bringing to today's discussion, and then a little bit about the organization from which you hail.
Sure. So my name is Renee Murphy. I'm a Senior Analyst at Forrester Research. Been with the firm about 3 years. Prior to joining Forrester, I was a network engineer, a VP of data center operations, and both an internal and external auditor. My coverage area for Forrester is security and risk management, mostly around risk management. I am one of 3 analysts that cover the governance, risk, and compliance space. Thanks to my auditing background, I talk a lot about compliance, but I also talk a lot about risk management and how that impacts almost every other thing you do in IT, certainly. But again, also what we do for the business. If you're curious about Forrester, Forrester is one of the most influential research and advisory firms in the world. We work with business and technology leaders to develop customer-based strategies that drive growth. We do an annual survey of about 500,000 consumers and businesses worldwide. This is actually the largest collection of data outside of the U.S. Census. So we actually go to great lengths to pull this data together in order to give that back to our customers or our clients as, as trend data for markets. We also do, through proprietary research, data, custom consulting, and peer groups and events, we create an experience for a Forrester client that is all about helping them challenge their thinking and lead change in their organization. So we do advisory, we do research. Part of my job is to not only write research, but to work closely with my clients to get them to understand why GRC is important, what are the best practices in order to implement that stuff, and what kind of tools they should use in order to do that. So that's what I do.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, we're going to look forward to digging into some of those experiences that you've gleaned from that customer and client base, and hopefully uncovering some of the hurdles and success stories that people have as well. How about you, Mike? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
I am the Vice President of Marketing for MetricStream. MetricStream is a provider of software for a broad range of GRC business process areas, ranging from internal audit, compliance, IT risk and compliance, vendor and supply chain risk and compliance, quality management, business continuity management, and a number of other different process areas. Can we provide a platform of technology to help enable customers through their GRC journeys and really help them automate and improve the efficiency and effectiveness of their processes. I've been in the software business for about 16 years in various forms, and all throughout I've really been focused on really helping users and organizations improve their business processes through utilizing technology. The GRC space for about 8 years and have seen everything from small organizations all the way to some of the most sophisticated companies in the world utilize and leverage technology to improve their GRC processes.
Well, it's going to be that streamlining experience and that optimization I think we're going to get into today as we discuss some of the best practices around this. So definitely looking forward to your insights here, Mike. Last but not least, Vivek, tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of the point of view that you're bringing to the table here from RSAM.
Sure, Brandon. Thank you. Thank you to the IT-GRC Forum for this opportunity. A little bit about my background. So my DNA really goes back into risk and compliance. So I've been doing this for about 21 years. 8 of those years I actually ran a services business that did a lot of consulting around risk and compliance management, which is where I got the idea for automating a lot of these processes, and that's how RSAM got founded about 13 years ago. And a little bit about RSAM. RSAM is a enterprise class software platform, really automating a lot of processes around GRC. We have a dozen out-of-the-box solutions. But one of the things we also bring to bear is the ability to build your own applications as well on our platform. And our claim to fame is that we are the fastest time to value. Less than 21% of our revenue comes from implementation services. And part of the reason for that is the know-how that we've gathered through implementing GRC for many customers, and not only the features and functionality within the platform, but it's also the underlying data model that makes it easier for us to implement faster than others. Now, a little bit of the company, RSAM itself, we've been in business for about 13 years, a well-run business, profitable since 2004. We recently raised another $32 million to accelerate a lot of the growth with a lot of exciting things we're seeing in GRC. And one of the things I plan to bring to the table today is really share our experience over the last 13 years in terms of how this space has evolved and what are the things that we're seeing both from successes and challenges from an implementation perspective.
Great point of view, though. I don't think I've ever heard exciting and GRC used in the same sentence before. I think that's a first for me, Vivek, but we're going to hold you to that.
Sure.
We're going to pause right now. We're going to leave just this slide up with all of our headshots and Renee's fabulous glasses so that you folks listening in either live or on the archive can put a face to the voices that you're hearing. Again, don't be shy. Make liberal use of that questions tab. We want to take the remaining time that we have here together to make sure we get your questions answered and make this an educational and informative experience for you. Renee, I want to start off with kind of a question. Vivek talked about the longevity, for example, that RSAM has had in this market. This market's been evolving, starting kind of in the early days with tracking some of this stuff with spreadsheets and such. And I see some similarity in this market that we saw in the SIM market as well on the security side, and that is a lot of perhaps false starts with some early entrants to the market, some forklift upgrades or complete rip and replaces. Where would you in the research at Forrester say we kind of are in the evolution or maturity of the greater GRC marketplace?
So I think if we were going to look at from just a maturity perspective, 0, I have nothing, and 5, I have the most optimal platform there is on the planet to ever do GRC. I feel like we're at about probably like a 2.5. And I think the market is actually following the capabilities of the people in the market, right? I don't think the users of these tools have gotten so sophisticated yet. I mean, you think about how financial risk management works, specifically related to credit risk, loan risk, actuarial risk, right? I think they're actually really good at that. They have very purpose-driven platforms that manage that kind of thing. It's all about the financial risk and the reward to that risk, and and they have real numbers around what they consider to be unacceptable risk, right? I don't think the rest of GRC is actually at that level. I think there's a case that we could be there, right? There's no reason why IT GRC can't work like financial GRC. There's no reason why third-party risk management can't work like financial risk management, right? There's no reason why we can't take all this incredible amount of data. Like you said, I just said this today on another call, like when will we as risk management tools start thinking like the threat and vulnerability management tools think today? Like there's tons of data. I'm just going to pull it all in. I'm going to normalize it all. I'm going to tell you what's really important, and that's the stuff we're going to work on because programmatically I figured out most of this for you, thereby accelerating you into a better position from a risk perspective. So I think while the capabilities of the tools are there, I don't think that the actual consumer base is there for those tools yet. So I think because the world is sitting at like a 2.5, so is the market. That's kind of what's driving that. But I think at the end of the day, from what I see in these tools today, I think they have the capabilities of becoming really strong transaction-based monitoring for all aspects of risk. We just got to get the risk managers kind of in flow with that and kind of get them thinking the same way. And honestly, if you're doing risk management today because you have a regulatory requirement to do that, probably the wrong reason to do it. If you're doing it because you want a holistic view of risk and you want to minimize that as much as you can so that you can, in fact, take more risk, then yay, you're doing it for the right reasons.
Start with the first principles and get the mindset right. I like that. I also like the way you kind of cast it as not necessarily a tool-based maturity scenario, but one where perhaps the market needs to catch up to the technologies in some case. And Vivek, I know with the platform you guys have there at RSAM, you have a number of pre-existing modules, many of which that Renee talked about, vendor and third-party risk management, financial risk, and all of these different types of directions. Is there any one kind of, we'll call it sub-discipline, for lack of a better term, that you find has a higher degree of maturity or sophistication, kind of building on what Renee has said?
It's across the board really. A lot of it depends on the verticals as well. I think, I even go back to Renee's comment about 2.5 being the maturity. I agree with that as an average, but when you look at the spectrum, it's quite broad. In some cases, we see customers that we even want to start with a good risk inventory, and many organizations don't even have that. On the other spectrum, you have customers not just have a risk inventory, they have an integrated GRC framework with focusing on business performance and things like that. So it's really across the board. I'd say average is 2.5. I think where we're seeing a lot of focus today is around efficiency in terms of the maturity itself, or whatever the use case, whether it's around having a risk register or doing compliance-based assessments or whatnot, and really trying to get more focus around efficiency. And I think as to Forrester's model of maturity, I think the other layers around business performance and all that is a little bit further away. But I think it's still largely going into efficiency still to play.
No, very, very good points. Glad you agree, though it makes for some boring conversation. I was kind of looking for a dissenting argument, but that's all right. Mike, I want to shift gears for just a moment and come over to you. With regards to these different sub-disciplines that we've kind of been talking about and the general maturity of the marketplace, but also, to Renee's point, the sophistication of our buying centers and our peers and colleagues within the organization. Do you find that there is one particular area or domain of risk where organizations can maybe find the most bang for their buck to kind of shoot for that, first 90 days, high degree of success, to put some wind in the sails and kick off a project like this on the right foot?
I would say, from my experience, it really becomes situational. There's different trends in different industries. Earlier, Renee mentioned that, potentially the only reason things is because you're required to do it. But for an industry where regulation and that process, you are forced to this as opposed to for reasons. We have a lot of innovations coming. Really 2 to 4 years. We'll start again things like so. I think this financial crisis and across the globe and other areas. Would say first of all it's educational. What we do see is there's certain areas that that organizations typically tend to agree on, especially when they're looking for an integrated approach. I would say the first discipline is in that around issue tracking, right? If you talk to many of our clients, they'd say one of the top 3 benefits they get across the organization is by having a centralized way to track their issues. Where people could argue, all day long on, what the risk register and risk tolerances may need to be. What they can agree on is that it's a good discipline to actually track your issues, to track your loss events, to track what's going on, and come up with action plans to remediate. That also provides some data and structure to actually influence potentially what you might want to do from a preventative standpoint on the risk management side. So I say that's probably one area that we've seen people focus on. I think another area is just around the discipline. If you look at any maturity model out there, documentation and standardization on some sort of framework or methodology, does make sense. And, I think one of the early things that we see organizations doing is just by getting the organization to agree on what the org structure is, to agree on what the control models may need to be, what the risk models need to be, and to start in one spot with that sort of structure, and then evolve that through a journey throughout the organization, tends to add value. Again, a lot of times people will focus just on an immediate pain point, so maybe it's internal audit, compliance, maybe it's threat and vulnerability or IT policy management. Typically is one of those areas, but again, have that broader view of how that might roll out across the organization, and there you're going to get the benefits.
Real quick, Mike, you were cutting out a little bit at the beginning and a little bit there towards the end. If you could make sure that your headset cord perhaps is shorting out a perhaps signal, and we'll come back around to you in just a moment. But I think Mike brings up a very interesting point that kind of dovetails, Renee, to what you said earlier in the maturity model assessment. As we move up the maturity model towards a more optimized operation, that requires feedback loops. And Mike, from what I heard from you, it sounds like the creation of some of this issue tracking, and as George Carlin likes to say, a place for your stuff, right, a place to put all of this material and all of this information, helps you perhaps create those feedback loops very early on that may be able to enhance your deployment or give you at least some visibility so that you can prioritize perhaps where you go next. Vivek, as we talk about where to go next, you used a very software development kind of centric term earlier, and that was use cases. Building upon a little bit about what Mike has just said about some of the areas where perhaps low-hanging fruit are, what are some of the easy win or use cases that you're finding your customers really gravitating towards right now, and how are you guys responding to those requests?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Brandon. One thing we do talk about with our customers is it's not so much one use case or another, but really giving some thought to the batting order in terms of which use cases to roll out first, second, third. And we actually have developed some kind of a framework for our customers to really think through that. So let me try to explain that. I believe there's 3 major things that's important in trying to figure out the batting order of these use cases. One is the readiness of the use case, meaning for a particular use case, do you have a methodology? Do you have a workflow? Do you have a content? And you may rely some of that on the vendor of choice, but making sure that you have those 3 things become very important before you start to embark on manifesting that within a GRC platform. Number 2, do you have the appropriate buy-in for this particular use case? Meaning for a particular use case, let's say for doing a compliance assessment, it may be very departmental focused, versus if you're doing a vendor management use case, you may have multiple departments in play. So trying to understand the buy-in from these different stakeholders is also a very important item as you think about the batting order. The third one is the ease of implementation. Across the different list of GRC applications, inherently, it doesn't matter whether you choose RSAM or any competing product. Inherently, certain use cases take longer than others. So really trying to figure all these 3 things and try to come up with some kind of a mechanism to prioritize which ones you need to go out with. And because end of the day, you made a comment about GRC and exciting, and it's not gone well together. And the reason is, in the past, people have gone with, I have to start out with policy management. Absolutely not true. In some cases, you may start off with issue tracking or policy exception tracking. you could have policies, but you don't have to go through a whole policy management life cycle. Take 18 months, and people lose interest in GRC. So I think thinking about the batting order, and it changes from customer to customer. Priority of a use case trumps everything, but thinking about that batting order and showing value quickly is very important.
No, and I'm glad you brought up the policy lifecycle use case as one that may or may not be the best way, because it is a long, arduous process from defining the workflow, identifying the people that need to be involved, be it HR, legal, perhaps employee relations, et cetera. That can be a very time-consuming effort, and one, I think, to your point there, Vivek, can actually stall perhaps your implementation because you don't get those wins.
Absolutely.
Kind of taking that, another step further, Renee. Curious from Forrester's research, because you guys have been compiling data on this market for quite some time now. Can you perhaps speak to some things you've uncovered, either yourself or your colleagues there covering this market, with regards to places you definitely don't want to start off with?
Yeah, I wouldn't start in finance. I mean, it's this idea that, it really is true, right? I mean, it's just like people have this idea that they're going to deploy a GRC tool and it's going to be like a help desk tool, right? That it's just going to kind of run itself. You'll fill in some stuff. Next thing you know, it's all working just fine. Yeah, that's really not true, right? I would say that it's akin to deploying a mid-tier financial system. Like, it's that complicated, right? You really do have to understand how your workflow is going to go. You need to understand what you choose to collect. I mean, at the very least, you should at least understand, what it is you consider risky and what tolerance you have for that level of risk. Otherwise, all of this stuff makes no sense, right? So I think in that perspective, you don't want to go chew off the big pieces that require a ton of work. Right? I mean, if you think about financial risk management and you think about that in a banking organization, I mean, you can imagine what that's like, right? I mean, those are gigantic platforms that do financial risk, and you probably don't want to touch that first. And where we may not look at, and it really depends on who you are and what you're doing. I think Vivek is very right in that thing. I would tell everybody, if you're starting from scratch and you got nothing else, I would start with policy management, because, the policy is the beginning. Well, the risk is the beginning. I mean, if we have a risk and we're thinking, how are we going to mitigate that? Well, we'll write a policy for it. Okay, great. Now we have a policy for it, so how are we going to mitigate this? Well, the policy is telling us we should at least adhere to these principles in order to mitigate that risk. Great, so now what do? We're going to put controls in place. Okay, we're going to put the controls in here. Audit's going to come in and do testing based on those controls. That's going to tell us whether or not this risk is still being mitigated appropriately. And if it is being mitigated appropriately, we don't consider it a risk, right? So you can see how integrated all of this stuff is. I mean, and I'm just talking about the risk management process. I'm not talking about HR risk versus IT risk. I mean, that's just risk management. Now go after what you think is the most important thing you do in a day and say, okay, what's causing us the most risk? Well, IT usually causes you quite a bit of risk, whether you want to realize it or admit it or not. That might be where you start. And again, it's not so simple that you're just going to slam it in and walk away. There's a lot of stuff to figure out. Would I love to see that you figured it out on paper first? Sure. Is that going to solve all the problems? No. I know people who went in and deployed entire, GRC platforms and had to throw away everything they did because the tool couldn't do it for them, right? They had to completely rethink how they were doing it because the particular tool they were in couldn't accommodate that. So you can do all the figuring it out up front, but sometimes that doesn't help you in the long run anyway. But understanding who you are, what your risk tolerance is, where you think you can get the most bang for your buck. I mean, that might start in IT. It's a really risky place, and the first time we have our head around that, it's an interesting thing. I'll argue this as well. I mean, there's no better way to get funding than a finding, right? So, I mean, if IT is a place you're struggling getting a budget done, start doing risk management there and see how quickly you can get your budget done. Because once you position this to the business as, no, you're putting me at undue risk, we've identified this as a risk. If we don't have endpoint management sometime soon, we're going to result in a breach, which will have all these cascading effects across all these different parts of the organization. Is that what you want? I think that's an interesting thing to say. So for me, I would say IT is usually the place it catches fire, and it goes farther out to the organization overall. But, I mean, would IT be where I start? I don't know. Maybe if I was trying to solve more problems. I think I would stick to something easy, though. If I was going to start anywhere, it would be with policy management. It seems to be like the right group of people who are at the top, who need to be invested in this, and getting them used to the tool so they can evangelize that as I go out and try to do this other places. I think that's usually what clients tell me is going on there.
Sure, and I can understand why, because it is so foundational. But a couple of things that you touched on are those integration points and how a lot of this technology behind the scenes relates to one another from a process perspective. And I want to come back to that in just a few moments. But Mike, I want to touch with you next. You know, we've heard Renee and Vivek both say, you know, one says policy, maybe not the best place to start. There may be some lower hanging fruit elsewhere. Renee's saying, yeah, but it's kind of foundational. What are you seeing in your customer base as people are going down this path right now?
Yeah, well, I would say, you know, one is we see people need to find a place to start, right? And again, I mentioned earlier, it's all situational. You know, what we are really finding that journey. You know, whatever that starting point is, let's map out that next 6, 12, 18, 24 months and to figure those logical areas, because everyone's going to have a different sequence on there. In certain areas where threat and vulnerability might be the issue, IT might be the place to start. In other areas where policy management or there's some regulatory issue pressing, you know, that might be the place to start. If there's people in your industry that have FCPA-related allegations and it relates to third parties, that might be the place. So it's not so much the starting point, it's the fact that you need to have some sort of discipline around what that journey is that you need to go through and how you're bringing everybody else on board. Which gets into the one, you know, area that we see a lot of people, you know, where they're looking to get funding and building their business case is reach out to your peers internally, right? Take out that, you know, if you are not talking to the compliance officer or the head of audit or the head of IT security on a regular basis, reach out, have those internal conversations. Chances are there's more commonality than you think. And, you know, it's oftentimes from a vendor perspective, we actually end up bringing those people together, right? That shouldn't have to be the requirement, right? So I would suggest, you know, for those on the call, reach out and have those conversations internally and build a business case internally of where you think you might have some leverage points and some immediate needs to solve.
What do you think about Renee's comment about findings equal funding? We had an interesting comment come in from somebody right after she said that, Mike. There was, you know, I wish it was just that easy. Sometimes management wants to bury the finding. What are your thoughts on using, you know, lead with the pain, so to speak?
Well, you know, one of the things I always ask people, you know, to kind of come up with the what assertions would you want to make to your board, right? Can you actually make certain assertions to your board as it relates to the maturity of your processes? Have that conversation, you know, with the management chain as it moves up and bring that up. You know, what we have seen, you know, really over the last 2 or 3 years, especially, for example, if you look at, you know, things related to IT, cybersecurity, and things like that, where it wasn't a board-level topic 2 years ago, it is now, and there's multiple studies out there that show that that is a top-level board topic, right? So those conversations are actually happening at the board, right? So if it is not meticulously laid down, I think it is, you know, required of those that are, you know, either in the first, second, or third line of defense to start having those conversations and to raise those risks up. Listen, we cannot make the assertion that we understand where third parties are. We cannot make the assertions that we have a full, you know, handle over the risk related to, you know, certain aspects of our business that might be important, right? Those questions need to be asked. Yes, it will take time at times to get funding, but I think if you can raise those issues and keep the conversation going and connect that with other parts of the business, the funding will be there.
No, and that's sometimes half the battle is, again, drawing a parallel from the security universe here with SIM technologies. It's going to get the data, right? Perhaps it's not the analysis that's the difficult part. Sometimes it's prying it out of another portion of the organization or getting it even in perhaps a structured format so that you can consume it, you know, and perform that analysis on it. Which brings me to another point. Vivek, I want to toss this question over your way. You know, you talked about the use cases and kind of the batting order and such, but I think to some of that comment that Mike made about where we're sourcing data, how we're getting it, all of these different sub-disciplines that Renee mentioned earlier probably have already experienced some degree of pain as they've grown, you know, up and are managing their own functions. You know, I joke that when Office professionals started bundling access in with the licensing pack that it turned everybody in the business into a wannabe developer. Next thing you know, we're running around scrambling for Y2K to patch mission-critical databases on people's hard drives on their desktops. How has the functions within organizations continued to evolve from spreadsheets maybe to using access databases, perhaps even SharePoint instances to track and manage some of these efforts? And how do you corral those people, to Mike's point about bringing other people kind of onto the bus with you for this journey, getting them off of their other tools and onto something centralized?
Yeah, it largely depends on whether you have already a platform in place or not. So let's play out both those scenarios.
Okay.
So in a scenario where you already have a GRC platform within the organization, and it's quite common that you may see 20 or 30 different other use cases that they may be using spreadsheets or SharePoint or whatnot. And I think what's critical there, assuming we got the funding, and that's a completely different topic we started talking about, in terms of bringing that other use case onto an existing platform, first we need to think about the organization fabric itself in terms of, is this person ready to bring this use case onto a particular platform? A lot of times it's not a technology issue. It's more a political one. So to the point of having some kind of a collaboration with other departments, it's very important. Now let's say it's within the same department, and there's a reason why you need to bring that onto an existing platform. One of the things that's very critical in terms of the GRC platform you're about to choose, is to make sure that you have a underlying data model that's highly extensible. So because what happens is when you start with a particular use case, you start thinking about the default structures, about the organization structure, the risk structure, the control structures, some of the things that Mike talked about in terms of documenting the framework. Now you bring on another use case that was actually built completely on a different framework perhaps, and maybe even have a different taxonomy, or maybe even have a different notion of scoring or methodology or workflow. Now, how do you take that and then manifest that to an existing platform? That's where the underlying data model of the platform you have is super critical, because now you have to worry about, how do I overlay with the existing framework that I have? If I bring that on, what is the benefit, how do I link the different capabilities of these different use cases, the integration and linking capability, and how do I do that without extensive rework? And the third, and the other reason to bring these tools onto the same platform, is the ability that senior management, would like to see a kind of a roll-up reporting. And how do you do that when these applications are developed independently? How do you share common attributes so you can actually eventually roll up? So, it comes down to two things. One, politically, do you have alignment? And two, from a technology perspective, making sure you have an extensible data model that can accommodate for that.
You touched on the term data model. I love having done software work and been a product manager in a past life. You're kind of speaking my language here between use cases and data models. This is great. One of the things that we saw come out very early on in the marketplace, driven largely by Honeywell being the first RFP to make this request, and for obvious reasons because they're assistants in underwriting, the Unified Compliance Framework. When we start talking about data models, Renee, I want to start off with you. How critical is something like that cross-linking that the UCF offers as far as a requirement? And are we finding that the more mature players or buyers, shall we say, are leveraging pre-existing models like that and abandoning their kind of self-managed mapping exercises so that we can get to that assess once, report many model?
Well, I think everybody wants to get there, right? I mean, no one wants to have 5 or different regulatory requirements. Each has the same requirement that you have to have visitors sign in at the data center door, and we actually go test that 5 times. It seems almost crazy, but that's what happens when you have different parts of the organization managing their own regulatory compliance separate from everybody else, right? And so you start duplicating all of this stuff. And that's, when you take a compliance-based approach, that's what you're stuck with. I mean, it's kind of how it works, right? But when you take that overarching approach and you say, I have one regulation that requires me to be OCC compliant, and everything else is going to fall under that just fine, right? So what I'm going to do is follow the COBIT requirements for this thing, and then everybody else, my ISO 27000, my FFIEC, my FISMA, partially some of my FedRAMP will all fall under that, so I only really have to do one framework, right? I think that everybody wants to get there. Now, you know, the data model, you know, whether you have on board the UCF or you're just saying, you know, data center door is the control I'm testing. It equals these 9 regulatory requirements and this best practice that I'm following. So when we run the reporting, it's going to all come out through those channels, and that's exactly what I wanted to do. Now, whether I need the UCF to do that or not really isn't the point. The point is we want to get to the point where we can do, you know, test once, use many. To do that, though, you really need to be really well organized, right? And that data model really has to be able to map that from the policy to the controls to the reports to the, you know, to the control owners, to the workflow. I mean, when you think of how much has to be mapped in order for the functionality of that thing to work, I pull up a policy. I can tell you who all the owners are that have some kind of control base in that policy and whether or not they've been successful over the last 6 months. That's an extraordinary linkage of data. One that happens as you use this platform. It's not there when you turn it on, but it's there as you use it, right? And you create this environment by where you can collect all this data together. I think the data model, to Vivek's point, is actually really, really important to a well-functioning GRC tool, right? And I think that the ability to get that data model right and to be able to get information from anywhere in the universe, quite frankly, whether I'm pulling RSS feeds from third parties, or I'm pulling things from my own financial system or from my own SIM machines, you know, however I'm getting this data in here, I mean, that's an important part of this interconnectivity piece of this. I mean, no one in their right mind, you know, I have a client who is a large oil and gas company, and they came to me and said, we did an inventory. We think we have 350 GRC tools in the environment. They had no intentions of getting that down to 1. They wanted 10. They're like, we're willing to get down to 10, but we need to figure out how that's going to happen. And what was interesting about that was only a couple of those were actual GRC platforms. The other 8 were environmental platforms that they don't make in GRC tools, right? So if you're doing greenhouse gas emissions, you're never going to find a way to find a tool that has that on board. But if we can pull that data in from a third party and make it relevant to our risk and report that to the board, that's what that GRC tool is there to do.
So this sounds like, Renee, we're looking at this as the perspective of universal consumer of inputs and sole source, shall we say, author of outputs, which I kind of like that. I kind of like that approach, and I think you're right that the model that you're basing this upon definitely has an impact. Mike, what are you seeing with regards to some of these frameworks, such as the UCF? Or perhaps some other models of approach like what Renee was discussing, just finding a way to technologically consume this data and represent it in a unified way?
Yeah, I mean, the conversation I've been having with organizations for years is, you know, think about doing financial accounting without having a chart of accounts and set of cost centers, right? It would be nearly impossible, you know. So every organization out there, you know, has those certain disciplines in other parts of their business where they have a structure to how they go about managing their data, right? So, you know, the same thing has to happen for GRC, right? You know, what is, in essence, you know, for IT, for example, what is your chart of accounts and set of cost centers, you know, in an IT parlance that you're going to utilize? Now, you know, I think for those that are lacking, you know, some sort of structured way, something like the UCF becomes a great structural starting point to go off of and actually put some discipline in and around the process. You know, some, you know, that are already embracing ISO and that may have been utilizing COVID in the past can utilize those elements if they don't have, you know, jurisdictional issues that UCF might address. So I think, you know, to me, it's not so much the model. It's that you have to have one, right? And if you don't have one, or, for example, if you have too many of them, right, you need to standardize, right? And I would, you know, again, cut across, you know, any other parts of your business and their operations, you will find standardizations on some sort of structured data model that helps you operate those processes, and that needs to exist in your GRC domains. So, again, my you know, advice to everybody is if you don't have one, you have to pick one. And, you know, if you need help doing that, you know, you can, you know, leverage advisory firms. You know, to me, software tools won't necessarily solve that for you. Again, you know, we help a lot of our clients out with that. But to me, it is, you know, first agree that you have to have one, and then kind of start that process of how you're going to standardize.
No, very, very valid point. Folks, with about 20 minutes left with our panel, I want to kind of shift gears a little bit. We've talked a lot about, I think, where to begin, and then perhaps even how to use feedback loops to improve and optimize and perhaps even streamline some of these implementations, how we can get to that, test once, report many kind of model through frameworks. And Mike kind of tied that point off very, very succinctly, I think, with just pick one and go for that to start and get that kind of complete. I want to go now towards kind of the longer term. We've made some of these improvements. We've got the tool deployed because I'm sure that many of us, participating in this conversation today are at various stages of our implementations. Vivek, I want to start this question off with you. You've got an organization. They've already got this deployed. They're showing some successes with this. And now it's time to start kind of spreading their wings, going and roping in some of those other disciplines that Renee mentioned very early on in our conversation. This is a multi-year process. This is a non-trivial endeavor. What are some potential pitfalls that people need to be on the lookout for as they continue to kind of land and expand some of these new opportunities?
Yeah, sure. Couple of things. I want to dovetail from the previous part of the discussion around assess once, report many, and I want to tie the pitfalls starting from that. There's been a huge hype in the industry around assess once, report many. And it works fairly well, but it's not perfect. What I mean by that, again, I'm a big fan of a lot of these frameworks like UCF and HITRUST, and Deloitte and IBM recently announced something that's coming out. So all these are really, really helpful. It takes a ton of work, attention to detail, hugely helpful, right? Now, and we talked about you need to have a data model that can embrace a partner content or technology, the vendor's content or the customer content. But one thing I would just caution people on is don't just assume these frameworks where assess once, report many will solve all your needs, because there are certain compliance areas where the controls are super prescriptive. So when you have a cross-map situation, the tendency is these controls get very generic. So, there are very prescriptive regulations like PCI and FSMA and whatnot, where really they're focused on the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. So you got to be very careful about the concept of assess once, report many. That can really get into a bind in the pickle. So just a heads up on that. Now,
good point.
Moving on, some of the other pitfalls that we've seen, we've talked about the two areas, right? Understanding the data model and the batting order. Nowadays, what we're seeing more and more is that, unfortunately, this is including RSAM, by the way, there isn't an Apple of GRC, right? I think most of the user interfaces are okay, they're not great. Usability has become one of the most important points of a successful implementation. So what do I mean by usability? Not just the user interface, but when a user comes in, now that GRC is very pervasive and goes across, really thousands of users, you want to make sure whether it's an analyst coming in or an executive coming in, focus on the usability. And that sometimes trips up people in terms of taking this further to your point about extending my wings and going into other disciplines. Usability is a very key point of the platform. How do you configure that? How do you make sure role-based views and all that good stuff? Second thing that we've seen is some of the horror stories we've seen is in situations where you have somebody managing the GRC platform, whether you break it up in a core admin or a functional admin, and you have a couple of key resources managing this platform. Suddenly if they leave or they took on another role, those programs come to a screeching halt because customers haven't really thought about a plan B. That plan B, which is maybe with another consulting company or the vendor you're relying with, make sure you have a plan B. Otherwise, you have a serious risk of that GRC program coming into a screeching halt. Third thing is we've seen more success when you compare, two sets of customers with similar use cases. We've seen more and more customers who have a very strong project management discipline tend to be more successful in their implementations versus people are trying to hack their way into it. They may be super smart technically, but there's a lot of pieces that come together. To Renee's point, it's just not, even though you may have that all laid out manually, when you actually go ahead and implement it in the GRC platform, there's a lot of considerations. And having a good project management discipline is highly recommended, and we've seen over and over again companies that have that discipline do really well, companies that really don't do well. And the last thing I want to say about this is what happens usually within organizations is, at least to date, right, you've got executives kind of hold the GRC flag, fight really hard to kind of get the money. They bring in a GRC platform. They have a vision. They start to execute on the vision, and 2-3 years down the line, the executive moves on. That's another time where it's challenging. It's challenging for the customer. It's challenging for the vendor because the new executive comes in. They come in with their own vision, and they look at the GRC platform that's configured, and they say, well, this is not what I want. And sometimes there's a whole education process that's required. Whenever there is a change in executives, it's very important to kind of make sure that either they're aware of the previous decisions that are made based on a particular platform, or if there's a new vision, having an opportunity to kind of sit down and understanding and laying out this new vision and the roadmap. Those are all things over the last 13 years that we have learned, working with our customers and some of the challenges and pitfalls.
I think that you touched on something that is very, very important here, and that is that executive handoff and that vision. I'm working through a situation right now where I have inherited a platform from my predecessor that, and it's not a matter of understanding the vision. I understand where they were going with their vision, but it also comes down to a matter of use the right tool and use the tool right. And he was doing some things that the software platform provider had not anticipated with their technology, and was, he had turned a wrench into a hammer out of just sheer frustration. And I think that's also kind of an important takeaway as we begin to extend some of these capabilities and look a little further down the road, that we need to maintain our champion and our clarity of vision, but that we also need to, a large degree, perhaps color inside the lines with some of these technologies. Well, folks, we've got about 12 minutes left here by my watch, and I want to take a few minutes to try to recap what we've heard thus far, and then I want to go around the table and get your thoughts on perhaps something that we wanted to address that maybe we didn't get a chance to, or something that we did touch on that either I didn't come to you for commentary, or perhaps it was really important and you want to double down on it. And Renee, I'm going to start with you, so there's your heads up. But let me kind of go through and summarize a little bit here today. Sounds like, one, when you start down this path, that there are some certain scenarios or perhaps use cases, to use Vivek's term, that are going to give you those early wins, but that you need to have a certain degree of maturity within your operations and your organizations, processes, as well as clearly defined ownership on those things that you want to take on. Perhaps in the absence of some of those very clear-cut, easy wins, you might want to start with something very foundational, such as either the policy components or perhaps the regulatory context in which you're attempting to operate as a place to begin to identify control, so that then you can move into things like control assessments and policy and those types of things. Another area to gain some additional maturity is, beyond automation, obviously, is to actually use feedback loops that give you clarity of operational performance. It could be things like incident tracking and identifying some metrics around not only that, but some of the other activities that you're doing, so that you know not necessarily what the score is and whether the good guys won or lost, but perhaps even how well you're playing the game. And that alone can give you dramatic insight into whether you move on to another area of focus or perhaps double down on that initial process or implementation area and give it additional attention to raise its level of maturity. And to Renee's point earlier, also from the research at Forrester, looks like the market's hovering around maybe a 2.5 on maturity here. So maybe if as a group, collectively, we can raise the level of maturity in this industry and in our own practices by focusing in on some of those feedback loops and meeting the vendor community where they're hoping to take us. We've also heard that while a very good start in moving towards the kind of unified worldview or harmonized controls, the UCF, which is licensed to any one of security and compliance products in the marketplace, is a great opportunity, but may be a little cumbersome for some organizations, especially smaller ones, perhaps without a large global regulatory footprint. But to Mike's point earlier, we also have a certain degree of, shall we say, again, maturity or sophistication that comes along with just picking a model and moving forward with that. Don't try to necessarily boil the ocean. Start small, but put the discipline and rigor behind it so that you have something to lean back on to provide a certain degree of perhaps unimpeachability to your approach. So with that kind of behind us as a summary, I'm sure I may have missed a point or two here and there, but Renee, I'd like you to kind of lead us off. Tell us what you think either we missed and you want to cover, or perhaps something that we did talk about that you'd like to kind of double down on.
Actually, I just wanted to talk a little bit about, where my research has been going lately, which is around reputational risk management. And I think what we're figuring out is, in order to manage your reputation as an organization, you don't look at that as a single risk, right? We don't put a risk in our registry that says, if our reputation goes bad, we'll make less money. I mean, how do you mitigate that? And where do you even start mitigating that, right? Well, you have to look at least from a reputational perspective, is that you need to create a reputational risk index, because what I found was downloading 55 10Ks from the banking, retail, and healthcare industries and looking at what the risks were at the board level. What do people consider risks at the board level? What I found was if you read it for just reputational risk, we're talking about 4%. 4% of those risks were related to reputation. But if you look at the reputational impact of that database, actually 80% of the risks in your registry today has some sort of impact on your reputation, right? So, I mean, we can talk about findings for fundings, and if that doesn't work, how much is your reputation worth to you? Because, we can look at BP as the canary, in the mine. We can say that it was an $8 billion fine for the Gulf of Mexico, but it turns out that, they actually lost $215 billion over the course of 2 years simply because of their reputation with their third parties. So when you start thinking about risk, and this is my thing about all of this, whether we're talking about security risk, marketing risk, sales risk, reputational risk, it's all there. We just need to create index to have reasonable conversations with board-level executives about business risk. We can't keep talking about financial risk or technology risk or security risk. We really have to find a way to make all of those data points relevant to business risk and have that in a conversation where we're posing it to the board as something that is really, we're concerned about the business. I don't care about technology. I care about the business, right? I think once we can begin to have those conversations at the business level, we can actually change the tide of our own maturity. We can change the tide of how we all address this at the board level, why we're important as risk managers to our board of directors, right? I think we can do all that, but we definitely have to get out of the idea of talking about singular risk as ITGRC or third-party risk and start talking about the business overall. I'd like to see that happen.
I would too. I was having a conversation with a colleague of mine over some beers not too long ago, and he said, what the single biggest risk to businesses are? And I started going off on all these, security concerns and things of that nature. He says, no, the thing that will take a business out of the game quicker than anything is management making a bad decision. Yep. And I think what you're speaking to here, Renee, is providing an authoritative source of risk that is holistic in nature and allows management to make appropriate mitigation or management decisions so that they don't inadvertently put us out of work. So, very good point. Vivek, how about you? Something we should cover?
Yeah, no, I think we've touched upon this before, but let me add a little bit more context, just again dovetailing what Renee said. If we are really thinking about presenting something of an overall risk, again, given the topic today about GRC implementations and the pitfalls and the challenges we've all have faced and evolved through the years, I still want to go back to this concept of I still feel like there's still a lot of focus from our customers and prospects in the industry, focusing a lot on features and functionality of these GRC platforms. But at some point, you have to open up the hood and look at the data model, because that's going to give you a better opportunity for you to be successful if you truly want to integrate all these different pieces of the puzzle and to have an overall view of risk. you want to make sure that you pay attention to the data model. And how do you do that? Well, you do that by not only just asking the right questions of the vendor. At some point, you have to get into a situation where you challenge the vendor to say, here are a couple of disparate use cases. How does it come together? And really, you need to start asking those questions now, not just for your needs today, but as in the future, because that's kind of where GRC is heading, very similar to what Renee is talking about in terms of how do you get the overall picture of the risk and all the reputational areas and the impact and all of that. It all has to come together. So I'd say look at the data model.
No, that's good. I think you bring up a very good point about tying use cases together. Don't just go off of what the vendor says is the right way to view the data or get to the analysis, but as Sun Tzu says, know yourself before you know your enemy, right? Understand what you want, what your business needs to drive those risk decisions that the board and other executive level folks want to get to, and tie those together yourself, and then go out for those requirements. Well, last but not least, Mike, I want to get your kind of closing remarks before I turn things back over to Kelly Vick.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the closing remark, and this is a question I get, a lot. I'm, standing at a trade show booth or at a customer site or even an initial sales call, is, where do you start? And, oftentimes, to me, it really kind of comes down to three things. First off, just acknowledge that every organization is on some form of a GRC journey. Some are, rapid pace and evolving and maturing things, in a very fast pace. Others are taking a slower, more methodical approach. But admit that you have a journey and, figure out and map out what that looks like for the next 6, 12, 18, 24 months, and have at least a starting point of where you're at with that. Second thing is, acknowledge that there's a lot of things you can do without writing a check, right? So you don't need to necessarily buy something in order to start maturing your processes today. For example, get a group of people together and do a 1 or 2 hour, risk workshop. Even if you're not documenting that, start the conversation. Start the, cross-departmental conversation on where things are at and get people's ideas, one, as to tolerance, and two, where, there may be issues inside of the organization. Right? There's a lot of things you can do just internally today without doing that. And the third is, when it comes time to look at things, right, technology plays a role. Find the point in time when you need to layer technology onto that process. Technology will bring discipline. Technology will bring efficiency. It'll bring automation if you've matured those other areas. And, the last thing a vendor wants to do is sell you technology if it's just going to cause you pain, right? So we need to make sure organizations are having those conversations first and foremost before they bring the technology in, because it will not solve necessarily all those maturity issues.
No, great point. Never automate a broken process, or you'll just fail faster and more efficiently. So very, very wise words. It sounds like from somebody who's been doing this quite some time. Thanks, Mike. Vivek, thank you also for your insight and support here, as well as you, Renee. We're looking forward to some of the additional research that you guys at Forrester uncover. So thank you all for your time. It's been a pleasure. Kelly, I know you've got some closing remarks and some insights that you want to pass along as well.
I do. Thank you for a great discussion, everyone. Thank you, Brandon, and thank you to all of our attendees for your questions. Just want to quickly say if we did not get to your question, we will try to respond by email. And I want to remind those listening to make sure you check out the attached resources through the tab in your console. So as mentioned before we end, I'll quickly go back around the panel to get closing remarks and contact information for today's audience. So Vivek, I'll start with you. We have the RSIM contact slide up here, and attached we have a white paper and some case studies. Do you have anything else you'd like to mention?
No, I think I really enjoyed the discussion. Brandon, thank you. Very well moderated, and I appreciate the opportunity to be on the panel along with Renee and Mike. Enjoyed it very much. Yeah, certainly, take a look at the white paper. We've had we continue to write white papers on GRC implementations. There's another update coming up in the next month or so, so certainly visit our website. It's a resource that you can download a lot of these thought leadership white papers. So thanks again, and looking forward to talking with you guys soon.
Great. Thanks, Vivek. And Mike, next we have you. We have the metric stream, web URL, and social media handles up here, and attached white paper from current trends and predictions for GRC. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, similar to Vivek, I welcome everybody to go to the MetricStream website, and again, we also do have a number of resources out there, and feel free to just even put in a question to our request more information tagline, and we'll get back to you with information and hopefully examples of how we've helped other customers mature their processes.
Great, thanks, Mike. And last but not least, Renee, we have your website address here for our audience. Is there anything you'd like to share?
Yeah, if you happen to be a Forrester client, I would say go download the GRC Wave spreadsheet. This is the one from 2013, but it gives you a really good idea of who the vendors are in the space, how they've competed, how well they've done. We've just kicked off the new wave, and so we'll be doing that over the course of, at least the briefings, over the course of the next month. And then we'll be publishing that sometime in September, so you'll get to see how the updated version of how all these folks are doing in the marketplace. And I would say that if you're not a client, visit blogs.forrester.com. It's the one place you can find some inkling of Forrester research without paying for it. So I would encourage you to go there, and you can find my blog under Renee_Murphy at blogs.forrester.com. So thanks so much, everybody. Mike and Vivek, always a privilege and pleasure. Brandon, thanks for the moderation. It was a really fun conversation. I'm really glad I could be here. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Renee. So that just about wraps things up for today, but please do join us again on June 23rd as Dr. Brandon Williams and our panel of experts will be providing a payment breach prevention plan on our next session. If you'd like to attend, please RSVP through the attachment link or through your console at the end. Before we leave you, please take a moment to provide us with your feedback through the ratings tab. We do value feedback and we take it into consideration when we're planning future events. If you'd like additional information related to today's topic, please visit www.itgrcforum.com where you can access our resources for free. I'd like to thank all of today's speakers for joining us, with a special thanks to our sponsors, MetricStream and RSM, without whom this event would not be possible. And of course, thank you to all of our attendees for listening. Please stay tuned for our next event and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.